Certification and Licensure Subcommittee meeting of the Tennessee State Board of Education. Subcommittee members joining us today are Mr. Bob Eby and Mr. Mike Edwards. We extend a warm welcome to the Tennessee Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. Dr. Honsetter will be with us shortly. She will lead us in a discussion later in our agenda. We also are pleased to have the Executive Board joining us today. So welcome. As always, we have a lot to cover and we'll begin after the usual reminders. I do ask for everyone to please keep your device on mute unless you are speaking. And presenters, please state your name for the record prior to your presentation. Thank you. So let's dive into the agenda with the first topic, which is ethics training for educators. Ms. Brittany Kendrick and Angie Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Angie Sanders, and I'm the General Counsel for the State Board of Education. As Chairman Hartgrove said, I'm joined today by Brittany Kendrick, who is our Assistant General Counsel for Educator Discipline. Today, our goal is to open up a conversation with you all regarding options to increase educator awareness of licensure discipline and ethics requirements. And I'm going to see here if I have the ability to change the slides or not. If not, Elizabeth, we can go to the next slide. Well, it's not changing on my end, but I'll go ahead and move forward. So I wanted to quickly review our master plan connection. Today's presentation supports the board's strategic goal of ensuring a high quality and effective teacher is present in every Tennessee public school classroom. We believe educator ethics and discipline serves that goal and that our board's licensure discipline work helps maintain the high professional standards that we expect of educators in Tennessee and ensures that students are not only learning, but that they're safe when they are at school. Next slide, please. So the idea for this presentation came out of a question that we seem to get pretty often at board meetings and workshops around what options are there for the state board to increase educator awareness of ethical duties and grounds for licensure discipline under state board rules. What we've done through this presentation is outline a few options that we as a staff have come up with to try to address this question. Brittany is going to run through some context and background here in a moment, and then we will dive into some of the options and open it up for discussion and questions. The hope here, again, is that we get some feedback from you all in terms of what ideas you would like to explore further, what concerns or questions that you have, and then are there other things that we haven't thought about, some ideas that you might have that you want to discuss. So this will just give us a really good foundation for determining what next steps we might want to take. So with that, I will pass it over to Brittany to give us some context and background.
Hi, board members. Again, this is Brittany Kendrick, Assistant General Counsel for the board. So on this slide, what you're looking at is what we found currently in state law that are the requirements with respect to training on specifically the Teacher Code of Ethics. So currently, state law requires that the LEAs conduct an annual professional development training on the Code of Ethics. We did a quick speak with the General Counsel for the Department of Education, and as far as compliance is concerned with these particular requirements, it's a general compliance that the LEAs submit to the Department of Education on all the laws. So which we'll discuss in a moment, the depth of the training and things of that nature really is pretty much up to the LEAs and how they handle the training and how they parse it out to their educators. Additionally, the state law requires that EPPs are to train the candidates for licensure on the Code of Ethics as well. But again, which we'll talk about in a moment, the depth and how that is being done is not always known or aware of how that's taking place. So if we want to go to the next two slides, you can see on this slide or these slides, we wanted to just provide you all with some background and some context of what the Teacher Code of Ethics says. For the most part, this is all of them. To make sure that it fitted on the slide, we had to eliminate a couple of ones, but these are, on this first slide, are what the educators' obligations are to the students. And just to highlight a lot that we see and that you all see come before you all, obviously we rely upon a lot that they're making sure that students are protected from harmful conditions when they're learning and their health and safety. We rely upon that one a lot. We rely upon a lot the emotional well-being of the student, making sure that the educators aren't embarrassing students or disparaging students. Some recent changes to this particular law that we rely upon a lot now are obviously not to engage with any sexually related behavior. And as you all know, that is a very wide breadth of what we see come to our office sometimes. And other big ones are not to furnish alcohol or illegal drugs to students, prevent students from using alcohol or illegal drugs, and refrain from themselves from using alcohol or drugs in the presence of students or on campus. So those are the ones that we see a lot come through our office in addition to other things that are in our rules. So if you go to the next slide, this one is in the Code of Ethics, discusses obligations to the profession. So how we see this come up, a big example of this one would be, as you all, some of you all who have been serving on the board for some time, you all may remember the Praxis scam out of Memphis where they were paying other people to take the practice exam, et cetera, and some of them have come back recently to apply for restoration. So this is where this particular code of ethics comes up, making false statements about your competency and qualifications for licensure of position, assisting entry into the entry when you know the person is unqualified. Those are the things that come up a lot in our office. And then additionally, the use of illegal or unauthorized drugs, that comes up a lot, obviously, in our office. And then obviously, pet security breach, administering state mandated assessments fairly and ethically. So these two slides that we just looked at are what LEAs and EPPs are supposed to be training educators on an annual basis. That's what consists of the training currently. So if we go to the next slide, the reason why we are here today and why we wanted to bring this discussion to you all to start the discussion and get some feedback from you all is because we noted that there are some current challenges with respect to what's currently being offered and what we think could be added as a board and as a staff to make sure that the educators in our state are complying with our master plan and getting a holistic approach in terms of ethics training in the state of Tennessee. So some challenges that we saw that we've kind of already discussed that have come up is a lot of times educators and even directors of schools in my work almost 4 years have no idea that this is even something that could affect their license. Obviously, our office, I think, has done a good job through Nathan and his team, and then our team of reaching out to central office staff, so directors of schools and HR individuals to let them know about their obligations to report. But I've gotten a lot of feedback from directors and individuals sometimes that they don't even know what happens once they submit the report. And a lot of times when we send letters to educators notifying them that their license could be affected because they violated the Teacher Code of Ethics and some portion of our rule, they don't even realize that their license could be affected for this. And so one of the big changes is obviously the lack of training and awareness around educator license disciplines, rules, and process, not just the Teacher Code of Ethics. So that's one of the missing pieces that we wanted to bring this conversation to you all to discuss about how we can, again, bridge that gap. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we only have one piece of the puzzle right now. We only have that their training is on the Code of Ethics by the LEAs and the EPPs, but we don't know what the depth of the training is. We don't know how efficient the training is. We don't know really how it's regulated for sure to know what they're telling the teachers when and what the breadth of it. And so we feel like if there's a place for our team and our office to expound on that, we want to make sure that we're doing it and giving a whole picture. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Angie to present to you all some options that we have come up with as a staff with respect to how we maybe can bridge these gaps and these challenges and get some feedback from you all to consider and figure out where we go from here.
So before you turn it back over to Angie, at this juncture, I do want to ask a question regarding, because it says the first, if you go back to the other slide, the first bullet says lack of training. The one before. I'm sorry. No, it was just the one that Brittany was referring.
Okay, so go for it, Elizabeth. I'm sorry. Go to the one that says current challenges.
So I have to ask the question because I spent the morning yesterday with directors of schools, and I did tell them we were looking at training for the Code of Ethics, just this whole subject matter in general. And so I asked a couple of questions, and this lack of training piece is what throws me off, because I believe, if not 100%, the majority of them know that they have the responsibility and obligation in the TCA code that we previously cited. It's their responsibility, the LEA, to ensure that this annual training occurs. And so we also are talking about, I know, the quality of that, and if they're covering everything they need to cover. So do we really know, do we really have the evidence, do we really have the data that says across the board the districts, the schools, or whoever they've delegated it to are not doing their job? Or is this our summation because we're hearing educators act surprised? They may genuinely be surprised. However, I think they might be embarrassed too, and they could be saying that their knowledge is not there. So I think knowing how they do it, if they're in fact doing it, who did they delegate it to? I think having the data would be more useful than making an assessment based on an educator's comment. That's my thoughts, my opinion. And then I'll tell you a few things, because I did hear about some presentation materials that they're using that they actually, some of them received from the department, some received from PET.
Yes, so you're right, Lillian. So I should clarify. So they are training, and we are aware of the fact that they are training and using information from the department and PET on the Teacher Code of Ethics, but only on the Teacher Code of Ethics specifically. So the last two slides that list out the Teacher Code of Ethics, they are training on that, and we are not discrediting that they're training on that. What we're saying is that they're not training on our process and our rules and what happens once they get reported to us, and we think that they should be, that the training should include our process and our rules as well, because their license could be affected by that whole process. So that's what we're saying. We're just saying that there's a lack of training on our process, and we think that it should include our process to give a more holistic approach on ethics overall, and not just the Code of Ethics. Does that clarify?
Yes, it does.
Lillian, could I add a comment?
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, so first let me say I'm really glad to see this, because I know every time we have the ethics discipline action, I bring this up and question, what is the training? And I don't think that that you're not having the training, but I think your second bullet under the first bullet, educators are often surprised that certain acts or misconduct, the question is how effective is the training? And I bring it back to something like in the industrial world, we have safety is number one. And we start off every meeting that we have with a safety message. And so maybe the question here is how often they may do their ethics training once a year, and they check the box and they say, yeah, okay, we've done it. Maybe everybody hadn't been there or whatever. But just a reminder at each staff meeting or something like that, or just one point, start off the staff meeting, this is an ethical issue or something, I think might help tremendously. So that's just an idea, is that, I think the training is there. The question is how effective is it, and what can we do to make it more effective?
Yes, exactly. That literally is the purpose of today's conversation, and why we wanted to bring it to you all, to see what we could do as a board and staff to address both of you all's comments and concerns. How often, how effective, what are they training on? How can we potentially aid in what they currently are training on? How can we support that work?
Okay. So Elizabeth, I guess we can move to the next slide, and we'll go ahead and dive into some of the ideas that we've come up with as a staff. So what we've done here is divide the options into two separate categories. The first category that we'll talk about are options that are within the state board's current authority, which means that these are options that we could begin working on to try to accomplish through revisions to either our board policies or rules without the need to change the law. The second category that we'll talk about are changes that would require a change to the law in order to move forward. And again, like we said, these are just ideas we've come up with. If there are additional ideas or suggestions that you all think we should talk through and consider, we would love to discuss those as well. We're just really wanting to try to get a conversation started. So in this first category of an option within our current authority is to expand professional development points, otherwise known as PDPs, to include licensure, discipline, and ethics training as a PDP. So As you all probably already know, PDPs are required by state board rules and policies for educators to renew or advance most licenses. Currently, to qualify as a PDP, the activity, so the conference, seminar, university coursework, or types of things, has to be related to improving educator effectiveness. As we stated earlier at the beginning, I think definitely the argument can be made that ethics and student safety is certainly one part of educator effectiveness. And we would, though, have to amend the policy to explicitly state that training on educator ethics and discipline would count as a PDP. This option would capture educators who are currently in the profession, as opposed to some of the options we'll talk about here in a moment that might not only capture people who are currently already licensed. However, it wouldn't necessarily guarantee that all educators take the training, since under the current way that PDPs are structured under our policy, some educators, for example, who have very high evaluation scores can earn all of their PDPs through those evaluation scores. I think there's an option if we made it a required PDP, then we could also capture those educators as well. I've made a note here that this option is contingent on the state board being allocated additional funds for staff to conduct these trainings. We've been advocating for this funding for the past year. It was something that was actually included in the governor's budget last year, but due to COVID was taken out. And this would include an attorney who would have as a major component of their work traveling around the state, conducting outreach, providing training on licensure, discipline, and ethics. Without funding for this new staff member, we could work to create some high quality training materials that districts could use to deliver the training, or we could create some sort of webinar that districts could use, but those would still require some additional funds. Of course, in order for the training to be high quality, we would much prefer that we do it in person, that our staff is able to go out and do it. We are the most familiar. Brittany lives and breathes this work every single day. But I think COVID especially has taught us that there are other creative ways in which we can still pull off some sort of training in a quality way, even if we are not able to go there in person and do it ourselves. So I can pause here if you all have specific questions about this, if we can do that, or we can wait till the end after you hear everything.
I do have a question, Angie, that I'd like to ask now. So with this expanded opportunity under the PDP, are we talking about this being done annually for every teacher and that they would get these PDP points every year? Is that what you're suggesting?
So I think that there's a few different ways to approach it. One of the options that we'll discuss in a minute is expanding that annual training that they're currently doing on the Code of Ethics to include licensure and discipline. Right. So I think there would be a way to maybe say that that training counts as a PDP if it covers all of those subjects. And that would be something we know that they're going to get annually. If we didn't go that route, then it wouldn't necessarily be something that they get annually. There would not be a guarantee of that because PDPs are something that they accrue over the period of their license. And then when they come either to renewing it or advancing it, then they just have to have those certain number of PDP points in order to be able to advance or renew.
Okay. And if we would not be in a position to have the funding to hire one additional staff member to do this? Is that what you're saying?
It's part of a comprehensive plan that includes more than just one additional staff member. But if we did get that attorney that was able to sort of focus holistically on licensure, discipline, and outreach and really going into districts and doing trainings, then that would be obviously our preference.
Have you considered another option, which is train the trainer and have the districts identify individuals that they would want to shepherd this work and make them responsible to ensure it happens? Because then you run into all kinds of challenges related to scheduling, timing, and all that, and the size of the school district and how many teachers they have that need to go through this. So
100%, yes. I think that would be the idea behind us creating some high quality materials that we would probably ask districts to send someone to sit through sort of a train the trainer type event, which would probably, in the age of COVID right now, at least be virtual, where Brittany could really walk them through and answer their questions. They could have a really good understanding and then be able to go out and do that training in their own district. For sure. I think that's one of the ways that we can try to be creative here.
Okay, thank you.
I think, again, the requirement is in there that they have the training. So the district should have that within their budgets to have the training. The EPP should have it within the teacher programs to have the training. The question is, how can you make the training more effective? And certainly, if we provided specific examples through an attorney or something like that was specific to Tennessee, I think that would improve the effectiveness of what the training is. But I'm not sure that would require a whole lot more for the districts and the EPPs if the training was being done effectively the way it should be, and we can help shepherd that. There's also courses. I know that when I went to the TSBA conference, there was a booth. There's an organization that does this and has videos and stuff that can be used. I think the whole thing has to do with awareness and making the teachers continually aware of what their responsibilities are and examples of how they can get going down that slippery slope. And so we ought to be able to work out some way that makes it effective without costing a lot of more additional effort.
Yes, 100%. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide because I think these sort of dovetail into this first one. So again, this second set of options are ones that would require some sort of expansion of state law in order to fully effectuate them. I think there are obviously ways in which we can try to push the conversation if we don't ultimately get a change to the law. But the first one is amending the law to that already requires LEAs to conduct these trainings on the Code of Ethics to also include grounds for licensure discipline. And I think one other piece of that would be trying to strengthen the reporting element to ensure that LEAs and charter schools are conducting these trainings. So as Brittany said, right now, it's just part of the LEA compliance report where they check that they've done all of the required trainings. I know the department has a list of those required trainings for districts so that they're not just like checking a box and being completely unaware of what they're checking a box for. But I think there may be a way to strengthen that reporting requirement. While, again, like Brittany covered, the Code of Ethics and licensure discipline are related since our rules include the Code of Ethics. The rules also cover other things, and we think it's important to reiterate to teachers that there's this Code of Ethics, but it also is attached to your license. Like there are consequences beyond just you might be suspended or fired from your job. You have a state license, and this is what it means. So we think that extra piece is really important. And like we've discussed, I think we could certainly, if we didn't get an additional attorney to go out and conduct these trainings, support districts and provide really high quality materials that ensure that they're covering not only the Code of Ethics, but also licensure discipline. Without changing the law, there's not necessarily a guarantee that they're going to do that because the law requires just training on the Code of Ethics. So we can support them and encourage them as much as we can, but without us changing the law, it's not necessarily a requirement. So that's why it lives in this category. Are there specific questions on that one? I feel like we've already kind of talked about this, but I think this could be something that could work in conjunction with the PDP. Like we said, like maybe making this training count as a PDP as long as it's quality and they potentially use the materials that the board provides. I think we would love eventually, like we said, to have staff that could actually say to districts, we'll come out and provide this training for you, that would be great. Or we could maybe, do sort of the 3 grand divisions and teachers could come and sit through a large training that we provide. I think there's lots of options once we're out of the age of COVID and if we get those additional staff members.
Angie, the one other thing too that it may be included somewhere here, but it's just one of those where the devil is in the detail. I think timing and when a teacher enters into the system also makes a difference in when that a district is ensuring they're capturing those new people, whether it's through their orientation that they do it or some other means. It could be very easy to miss some folks that have come in after the training was conducted, and then it's forgotten that they didn't have it. There's all kinds of things related to that. So I would want to make sure that we include when they capture them. If they do it every year, but that they have it included in their plan that when a new person's hired, it's one of the first things you need to make sure. And I'm not talking about necessarily somebody who's just right out of college, because they should have received that while they were in college. But nonetheless, it's still, the burden is on the district, in my opinion, to ensure that they do their part, and it doesn't hurt to double dip, if you will, and make sure they have that training. So,
that's great feedback, Lillian. I appreciate that. And I think that's something we could include if we brought a bill on this, that not only would it have to be annual training, but it would have to include new teacher training as well for their new educators. So the next option that we've come up with is related to the first, and I think it's important to point out that these 2 laws, this is an expansion of the 2 laws that Brittany discussed earlier, and those 2 laws went into effect as part of the same public chapter. So it was sort of the 2-pronged approach of annual training for educators who are currently licensed and then requiring EPPs to do training on teacher code of ethics for their teachers that they were training. This would expand on that EPP requirement to include, again, training on licensure, discipline, and state board rules. So really reiterating to new educators that, hey, you are going to have a state license at the end of this, and this is what it means. And these are the potential consequences for what some type of misconduct. Again, the downfall to this option is that it only captures educators at the point of entry, and unclear whether or not this would involve some sort of cost to EPPs, depending on how they currently accomplish this training for their students. But we think it would be important that if we do one in terms of expanding the training that we're asking LEAs to do, it would be important to also think about the training that they're getting on the front end with EPPs. Questions about that one? Okay. So the third option that we've noted here is requiring some sort of ethics exam prior to obtaining licensure in Tennessee. There are a few other states in the Southeast that have similar requirements. Most notably, Georgia has a Georgia Educator Ethics Assessment. That is a requirement for licensure. There are a few other states, and we can dig into that in a minute if you have questions, but this would only capture educators at the point of entry again. It would add an additional requirement before licensure can be obtained. And it is also likely that there would be a cost associated with not only creation of the assessment, but then as well as administration of the assessment. Some of the other states that do something similar, Mississippi has an exam that it's an ethics module assessment that they ask teachers to take before they can receive a pre-service teacher license, which seems to be a type of license that they have that they give to teacher candidates who need to go out and do their student teaching. So it's a little bit different, not really something that we have in Tennessee, but they do have an ethics requirement and an ethics assessment requirement. Arkansas has a ethics and discipline training that anyone for similar to Mississippi, sort of a pre-service license has to take, but it doesn't seem to be an exam. It's more of like a training that they have to certify that they completed before they can get that pre-service license.
Angie, question.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting concept. These states that have these requirements, is there any way to compare the number of ethics issues, violations, reports that they have versus, say, Tennessee? So is the statistical data there that shows that something like this is in fact effective in reducing the number of ethics issues?
I think that's a great question, Bob. I think based on some research that we had, and we would have to go back and look at it, but we had one of our research analysts last year do some research on states. I think she did 10 states, mostly southeastern states, and looked at like how many reports are they receiving, how many staff members do they have, that kind of thing. It was really anecdotal. For the most part, most states weren't publicly posting this information. She had to get on the phone and call them, and some were more willing than others to give us the information around their caseloads and the number of reports that they received. So we could certainly look back at that. I think that Arkansas, Georgia, and Mississippi were part of her review, but I'd have to check. But we can certainly look into that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know if this were a national issue, if it were a Tennessee issue, and maybe we're making an issue and it's not an issue. Maybe our numbers are so low. I mean, the percentages are, compared to all the teachers in the state. But I don't know if that's something Tara could do or something like that. I mean, it would certainly be worthwhile knowing where we stand with regard to nationally, if we could.
Yeah, we can continue to dig into that. I think one thing that is a little bit hard to do an apples to apples comparison is that every state's rules are different. Mm-hmm. So some states are very prescriptive in terms of the types of misconduct that they'll take action for, and then other states have a pretty wide brush. And I think we saw some, Brittany corrected me if I'm wrong, that they allow anyone to submit a report to them. So their numbers were highly inflated because not only, like in Tennessee, where a director of schools submits the report, in those states, any parent, anyone could submit a report to them. So it's a little bit hard as an apples to apples.
Right. Yeah, I would say Andrew's definitely right about that. There are a lot of states from their report that our fellow did last year to show that, like she said, like a random individual can submit a form and submit a report, directors report, like anybody can. So that makes it kind of tricky. And then also, like, it's each from state to state, it's kind of different in terms of, like, Tennessee, we've tried to narrow down and really look at student safety, but it's like something happens like off campus, not involving any students, and it's just you happen to be, I'm trying to think of an example, like a DUI where no kids are involved and it's a one-off offense. Versus in another state like Florida, for example, they will potentially suspend the educator's license for a certain amount of time, whereas we may not because no students or children were harmed or there isn't a pattern of behavior for that person. So we do have some information that we can provide to you all limitedly that like looks at how the number of teachers that each state has and like generally speaking like how many reports that particular state gets on an annual or month-to-month basis. Where we did look last year to kind of see when we were kind of developing our staffing request to see, okay, well, Kentucky just off the top of my head is similar to Tennessee in terms of number of educators and seemingly number of reports that they get, but in terms of actually like specific violations, that can be a little bit getting into the weeds, but we can do it maybe at a high level response.
And I'd like to, because I think, Brittany, thank you for that, but I also want to piggyback on what Bob said, because I think sizing the issue is critically important, because depending on the size of the challenge, the size of the problem, and we know there have been months where we've had just one too many cases that came before us, but I think before we would go off and wholesale make recommended changes that can turn somebody's world upside down, who's perhaps doing it correctly, but would do it better with better materials. And, whether we would take what the department put together or PET and added the licensure piece and do some really rich training, deep dive into this so that it's clearly understood and that we give the districts and the principals and those that are conducting the training what they need, because again, we can make this much larger than it really is. I'm glad that Bob made that point. I still think we really need to size it. Thank you.
So,
Sure.
can I ask, I'm sitting here wondering, it appears when I'm looking at this that we have kind of two areas of these ethic codes. One are law. It's either, like I say, obey, abide by all federal and state law. And yeah, I think that teachers or educators need to know what applicable laws affect them, but giving minors alcohol is a real problem whether they're a teacher or not, and we shouldn't ignore it. But I guess what I'm saying is that there is the area of law that we need to make sure that they know what the law is. So, but ethics also includes moral and value judgments that are expected of a profession. Brittany, you and Angie had to fully understand what the ethical code was to be an attorney, because you could get disbarred and a lot of other things, not by breaking the law, but by breaching ethics. So I think we need to also make sure that they're in here, that they understand that there is a code by virtue of their professional license that holds them to a higher standard than just obeying the law.
Agreed. So it sounds to me like, and I know we're a little bit over, we can certainly try to get you all some of that additional data on what other states are looking like. In terms of working toward expanding the trainings that are currently happening, we can start to figure out what that could look like and then potentially bring back some data to you all. Is the data concern more around whether we would want to go the route of some sort of ethics exam versus just expanding training requirements? Am I understanding that correctly?
That would be my position.
Yeah, I think so too, but again, I don't know till I see the data to really know how big the problem really is. I mean, every time we vote on one of these license issues every quarter, I just cringe, thinking how in the world can people do what they do and not think about, and are we not effectively training? But on the other hand, if 10 a quarter or something like that is minuscule compared to the number of teachers that we have across the state and compared to what's nationally, then I agree with what Lillian says. We want to size the problem right to be sure that we're addressing it correctly. And it may just be an improvement in the effectiveness of how the training is being done. I think that could make a big difference. It's just, making it more effective. And like I say, an ethics topic at every staff meeting to start it off might just remind people of what Mike is saying, they're being held to a higher standard. That is what their profession expects, and it just makes them think about it.
And Angie, I would suggest you or Brittany and Michael Durline, someone can get the materials that I believe, I'm not sure if Christy Ballard produced them, but I do know that her PowerPoint has been sought after by districts, and they said yesterday when I met with them that they do modify them, and what kind of modifications, I didn't ask for any details on that, and some were using PET. So I think you could take that as a basis, and does it even include any of the licensure components? And if not, clearly that would be what we would add, and you might address some other changes in that document instead of starting from scratch. Thank you.
No, thank you all. This has all been very helpful. Appreciate it. I think we are moving on to the next one then, Amy.
Great. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation by both of you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Erica Light, Senior Research Associate for the State Board, and I'm also joined by Amy Owen, and we are going to talk a bit about updates on the 2020 Educator Preparation Report Card. So my agenda for this portion of the presentation, first we're going to review recommendations from our Report Card Advisory Council. Next, after that, we will set or discuss setting performance benchmarks for the 2020 report card and also finalizing the scoring framework. And then we will briefly discuss the next steps in production of the report card. So this slide here is a copy of a slide that we presented to you all during the last Licensure and Preparation Subcommittee meeting. This gives different options for how we could potentially report the provider impact domain of the report card this year, given that we do not have any new teacher evaluation data from the 2019-20 school year. So we had these three different options that we considered. We also presented these same three options to our Report Card Advisory Council, which, as we discussed during our last meeting of this subcommittee, includes a variety of stakeholders from EPPs primarily, but also districts and some external partners like SCORE and TERA. So we had these three options that we considered. We could give EPPs a provider impact rating and an overall rating, just like we would in a more normal year based on what data we have available. In the second option, we could give the EPPs neither a provider impact rating nor an overall rating in recognition of the fact that we have less data available this year than we normally would. And option 3 was actually suggested by an advisory council member that we could provide a provider impact rating, but not an overall rating. So given our presentation or a discussion with the advisory council, a majority of them recommend that we select option 2. This would be, in their opinion, the fairest option for EPPs. And they noted, many of the council members noted that there has been flexibility and easing of accountability requirements for K-12 schools and districts during this COVID-19 public health emergency. So it makes sense to also extend this flexibility to EPPs, and they feel that this option is the best way to do that.
Bob,
so,
I know you, sorry, you're on the advisory. Add anything about that discussion and how it went, any input there?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. It was a very lively discussion, and I think as we went through it at the beginning of it, I can't remember who it was, Victoria, somebody listed what had changed every year over the last 6 or 7 years, and some substantial change had been made, whether it was a delay in scores or difficulty in getting this. And all this really makes it difficult to have an accurate scoring process. And then I think everybody agreed that we need to have, accountability, transparency, but particularly with the governor's recent announcement on, providing some leeway in K through 12, it only seemed fair that option 2 probably was the most appropriate option under these circumstances. And, I think we all want the accountability and the transparency, but I think we also want to be sure that we have accurate information in providing that. And I think that was one of the questions that was brought up, is how accurate is the information that we have, because the number of participants varies from EPP to EPP and from year to year. And I think that's why this option 2 was what came up with.
So, Bob, or any of us, it almost sounds, and I agree, that we need to avoid any being punitive where it doesn't apply given what we have with information. EPPs certainly are justified in not wanting to be held accountable for what they can't be, if the world's changed. So let's move on beyond that. So what I'm wondering, you've got kids in college paying money to get trained to be a teacher. They're going to walk out, they're going to walk into a classroom, and they're expecting, they have a reason for that expectation to know how to do the job. There's 44 EPPs in Tennessee?
Yep.
So
around 40.
Huh? So there's a whole, I want to know how they know, how each EPP knows that their students are prepared to go into the classroom.
Sure. That's a great question, Mike. And we do always want to make sure that this tool is useful and transparent for lots of different stakeholders, including teacher candidates. While we would not score provider impact this year, we are still going to report the data we have available in comparison to the state average, so people could see what percentage of teachers are level 3 or above from each institution. There just wouldn't be the accountability tag attached to it of did you meet or not meet or exceed state expectations. We are still going to have those accountability ratings on our other domains, and we're actually going to hopefully add a new domain this year, which is what Eric is going to talk about next. So there's going to be continued transparency and accountability in all the other domains. It's just that for provider impact, we're not going to add that accountability tag to it. And with there not being an overall score, I mean, you're right. A candidate would have to do a little bit more digging. They wouldn't just get a label on the whole program of meets, doesn't meet, or exceeds expectations. They'd need to go look at it, look at each domain, look at the data, but the information is still there.
Yeah, I think that's the key, Mike, is that they're still reporting the impact data. So it's there for the students to look into and to evaluate. It's just not an overall rating that's on there. So I think the data is there.
In a lot of ways, I'd be happy if we had a way to look at if EPPs are getting an adequate amount of information to look at their product and say, hey, we got to make some improvements here and here and here. Take action on those and try to improve that so that they can say, we self-evaluate all the time. Here's what we've discovered and has suddenly been going on. Here's what we're doing to protect that student and those students, and to give a product that employers can have confidence in.
I don't think there's a single EPP that, at least that I've talked to through the council, that doesn't use the data and look at the data and figure out what can we do to improve that data. The question is the quality of the data this year over the last few years because of how things have changed. But yes, I think you're right. I think the EPPs are, every one of them recognize that they want a continuous path of continuous improvement, and they're using that data to look and see where they can improve.
That's great. That's great. Good.
And just so y'all know, we do have our kind of sister report from the Department of Education. They give EPPs much more in-depth annual reports that they can go into a much more granular level of analysis. And one of the ways to meet expectations on the DOE annual report is to either meet the set threshold or to have a certain amount of growth in that area. So that really is, Mike, where you have that incentive for annual improvement and growth.
Great. Good.
All right. So are there any other questions about this topic related to the provider impact domain? If not, I'll move on to the next domain. Okay, sounds like not at the moment. You can always ask again later if you'd like. So next, I'm going to discuss the candidate assessment domain, which is a domain that evaluates a provider's performance in preparing candidates to pass licensure assessments. So that includes both the pedagogical and content area assessments that are required to obtain a Tennessee teaching license. This domain was introduced on the 2019 report card, but it was unscored at the time. Based on the discussions we've had with our advisory council and the fact that we have no provider impact data from 2019-20, we are recommending that the candidate assessment domain become a scored domain this year. This domain would be worth 15 points, and the advisory council suggested that we split these points between the pedagogical and content assessment in such a way that there's greater weight on the pedagogical assessment. The reasoning behind that is that the new pedagogical assessment that has been required since January 1st, 2019 is the performance-based EdTPA assessment, which requires a lot of work from the candidates and the EPP in preparing a variety of materials over the course of their student teaching. It's not just you go to a test center and you sit down for 3 hours and take a test. It takes a lot more work than that. And the EPPs felt that it would be appropriate to give that pedagogical assessment greater weight since it does require more effort from both them and their candidates. Actually, I have one more slide about this, but you can ask any questions at this point.
Eric, let me just make a point here that going back to looking at my notes here on candidate assessment domain, all the EPPs like that domain. I think every one of them felt like that was an important domain, is how the candidates actually assess. And so they were very positive about this.
Thank you, Bob. So just to provide a few more details about this domain, in the period covered by the 2020 report card, it includes 2016 through 2019. So that covers the transition between the old pedagogical assessment, which was the practice principles of learning and teaching, and the new EdTPA assessment. So for the 2020 report card, what we're planning to do is to count candidates as having passed their pedagogical assessment if they passed either the PLT exam or the EdTPA exam within 2 attempts. So within 2 attempts is the same, that's the category or the rule that we apply to all exams, pedagogical content. And I believe the department also applies the same rule. So that's just the rule that they've been applying, and we've decided to adopt it as well. And in the future, as we move to more future cohorts of candidates, there will be fewer and fewer candidates in the report card who took the PLT and more candidates who took the EdTPA. We also have a suggestion from the advisory council related to the assessments on teaching reading. So teacher candidates in many different endorsement areas are required to pass an assessment on teaching reading. This is in addition to their more specific subject area assessments that they have to take to get licensed. And the advisory council has recommended that these reading assessments be reported as a subcategory of content area assessments so that stakeholders can view the pass rate on these literacy assessments separately from other assessments. We did include these assessments last year under the category of content assessments, but they were not separated out. So there was no way to view just the pass rate on the literacy assessment.
Erica?
Yes, Mike?
So part I want to go back and revisit content versus pedagogical scoring. I'd be interested in seeing what the proposed spread is on how much weight. Is it 60-40? Is it 30-70? That might influence how I feel about that everybody should feel about it. The other thing is reading being a subset scored out of content, and content being devalued, for lack of another word, in the overall score. Could reading be as a subset devalued more than we would expect or hope for?
Well, I will note on a separate note that the department has these literacy assessments as a completely separate category that the EPPs must get a certain percentage of their candidates passing in order to meet their expectations. So even if they are not broken out that way on our report card, they will be for the purposes of the department's accountability system for EPPs, which is not new. It's been that way in previous years.
Okay, got it.
So then just to piggyback and to be clear, so the assessment of the teaching of reading as a subcategory, it will appear in the content side of it or just the content side? Because couldn't it potentially be on both?
I see what you're saying. We've traditionally classed it with the praxis subject area assessment. The assessment, I believe, is teaching, it used to be the TREE, the Teaching Reading Elementary Ed. I'm not sure if that's still the test name. But candidates
I think it is.
Okay, good. The candidates have to take it for early childhood, elementary, the middle school content areas, ESL, special ed. Many, many candidates take this. I'd be curious from the board's perspective if that idea of having the overall did you pass your subject area exams and then a disaggregation saying literacy versus other content areas, does that sound like the right track for you, or would you prefer to see it even broken out differently with its own point totals assigned?
You know, I'm sitting here thinking from the lens of our conversation centered around literacy and the fact that what is the percentage now? Is it 38% of children cannot pass? They're not reading on grade level at the end of the third grade. So I'm sitting here thinking about that. We've often wondered because we don't know, and I think, again, my thing is I always want to know, I want to seek to understand, and I want to have the facts, I want to have the data before we make a final determination. However, when teachers are saying that they leave college and they don't know how to teach reading, that causes me concern. And I'm not saying that it's any one particular EPP. It may be that somehow it was lost on those particular teachers, or it was before their time. They could be in the system for a number of years. And I apologize to all of our Ed Prep leaders who are on this call today, but I really want to understand this because, you know, we keep talking about what's on the horizon and the science of teaching, and I'm just concerned that teachers don't know how to teach. And so if we're not putting the right emphasis on it before they leave the EPP, then I'm concerned that they don't really know how to teach, because we talked about that. When it comes to content, you can have the knowledge, but if you cannot teach something, then this is where EdTPA comes in, and we're pleased with that approach. So, Amy, I don't have an ironclad answer, and when we have the discussion led by Dr. Hansetter, I do want to, to explore that, because I don't feel like I can just sit here and say, I know for sure. I want their input. I value that.
I will say, I believe that
Sarah, I was just going to suggest the same thing. I think that would be an important thing to talk about with the trustee board. And I agree. I think increasingly, some of us were a part of the conference this week at Excel and Ed and listened to some sessions about the science of reading. And, the evidence is abundant now in terms of how to teach reading. I think getting more on the same page as a state, starting with our EPPs and the way they're teaching reading, is going to be really important to student success moving forward. So I think this is a really critical conversation to have with our EPP partners. Not only how are they doing the instruction, but do we have the right assessment, and how are we measuring and sharing the results of that assessment to ensure that teacher candidates really are coming out ready to teach reading in an effective way. That's everybody's goal.
And Sarah, I'm just going to say, I generally believe the pass rates on the reading assessment are fairly high, which would suggest that EPPs are preparing candidates in the way we've asked them to, which is great, but you can't ask for more than that. But as Sarah said, that might lead to a different discussion on, are we asking for the appropriate things and how would we know?
Right. We've said for a while, we need to look at that reading assessment and make sure it's really honing in on those key foundational components of the science of reading and looking at, the components there that we want to make sure are being measured appropriately. So I agree, Amy. There's probably a little bit more uncovering to do.
I think Erica has a few more slides. I know we're a little bit behind, but these will be, I think, a little bit quicker discussion.
All right. So moving on to the satisfaction domain, this is a domain that reports how well candidates feel that their preparation program prepared them for teaching. This was also introduced on the 2019 report card as an unscored domain, and the data for this domain are from the early career branch of the Tennessee Educator Survey, which is administered each spring by the Tennessee Education Research Alliance at Vanderbilt University in partnership with the Department of Education. We have a member of TARA, or rather the faculty director of TARA, Dr. Jason Grissom, was on the advisory council this year, and he advised us that the response rate for the 2020 educator survey was significantly lower than usual due to COVID-19. And so for this reason, we felt that this was not the appropriate time to begin scoring this metric. So we are going to report this again as we did last year, but we are not going to attach any points to it yet. And in the future, before attaching points to it, we would need to make an analysis of what type of or what level of response rate would be necessary in order to attach points to this. We had a few additional topics of discussion with the advisory council, which I won't spend too much time on, but we talked a lot about the importance of clear communication this year, particularly if EPPs are not assigned an overall rating. Basically, we'll need to make it so that there's still a clear story to be seen about the EPPs, even if there's not a single overall rating. We discussed making data about occupational teachers visible for EPPs that have a large enough number of those. And we talked about potential informational metrics that we might add, not for this upcoming report card, but for potentially the following one. One idea was having a student highlight where EPPs could highlight either a student or an outstanding alum of their program, just as a way to showcase what their program has accomplished. Next, we have some performance benchmarks that we need to discuss for this year. Hopefully this won't be too complicated because it's not too different from previous years. Each metric has both a floor and a target. EPPs that are at or below the floor for the metric will receive 0 points for that metric. EPPs that are at or above the target will receive full points, and EPPs that are in between the floor and target receive a proportional amount of points. To meet expectations, you need to receive at least 50% of the possible points, and to exceed expectations, you must receive 75%. These were our performance benchmarks last year for the metrics shown here, which we will have all 4 of these metrics again this year. These metrics were not affected by the cancellation of testing or by COVID. So these benchmarks that we set last year were based on a 3-year average. They did not include the current year, which at the time was 2019, because we did not want to make it so that there was like a set percentage of EPPs who were receiving each rating. We want all EPPs to have the opportunity to show improvement. And they were rounded a bit to make these final targets here. For this year, we have a couple decisions to make here. So using that 3-year average, so we dropped off the oldest year and added on a newer year of data. And based on that 3-year rolling average, it suggests that we may want to increase the target for both percent of racially and ethnically diverse completers and percent of high demand endorsements. So from the previous slide, you saw that the percent of racially and ethnically diverse completers target was 30%. And for high demand endorsements, it was 35%. So based on our update to the 3-year rolling average, we could potentially raise both of those by 5%, keeping the floors the same, which would have the effect of raising the thresholds for meets expectations and exceeds expectations to the levels shown here in this chart. We also need, since we are scoring the candidate assessment domain for the first time, we need to establish performance benchmarks for those two metrics, the pedagogical and content assessment metrics. Based on previous EPP performance on these metrics, I recommend setting the floor for pedagogical at 90 and the target at 100. I know 100 seems very high, but we actually had on last year's report card, about a third of EPPs would have met that target of 100. And for content assessment, 80% and 95% are my recommended floor and target. So any questions or discussion about these? Do you think that we should go ahead with raising these first two targets, or would you like to keep them the same for now? And what are your thoughts about the targets for the two new metrics?
I have a question.
Yes.
What is the percent of racially and ethnically diverse students that we have across the state? How does our target match that?
So the most recent data I have, which is from a couple of years ago, was 37% racially and ethnically diverse. So either their race was non-white or they identified as Hispanic or Latino. So the target of 35% is close to that 37% of students.
Thank you.
And I will say, I mean, the fact that we're talking about increasing expectations based on that 3-year rolling average is because we've seen improvement from many, many EPPs across the last 3 years, which is probably implicit, but I just wanted to say that that's a really great thing we're seeing, that EPPs are working so closely on these goals that are important to the state.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thoughts on this? Do these look appropriate to y'all? You could also email Erica afterwards if you have thoughts later on.
Yes, we will need to set these fairly soon, since we have to send our data to our website vendor shortly. But if you have thoughts that you want to send me after this meeting, that's fine as well.
I think that would be good, Erica, because I am curious to know, you mentioned in the pedagogical assessment, 1/3 of all EPPs are at 100% now. I'd be curious to know what percentage are in the other categories as well before we finalize that recommendation.
Yes, we also know that the 100%, or the third of EPPs getting 100%, was during a time period when many candidates were still taking the PLC. So as we have more EPPs and more candidates switching to the EdTPA, they've already switched to the EdTPA, just to be clear, but we have a data lag on the report card. So as more of the candidates on the report card have taken the EdTPA, we will reassess these pedagogical assessment targets to see if we need to adjust those based on the increased rigor of the EdTPA.
Okay, thank you.
All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on for the moment. So this is our proposed 2020 scoring framework for the report card. We still have 10 points reserved for potentially scoring the satisfaction domain in the future. That's the same as we've had in the past. And the largest number of points is normally for the provider impact domain, which is worth 40 points. But as we discussed earlier, we have decided that it is best to not attach accountability to that domain this year. So those points are being reserved for use again in future years, but will not be used this year. We have for candidate profiles and employment, those are the same point values we had last year. For candidate assessment, I mentioned that we have 15 points set aside and that the EVPs and other stakeholders on our advisory council recommended that we give a greater point value to pedagogical. We did not have a very in-depth discussion with that group about how much greater they wanted the point value to be for pedagogical. So as an example here, I've got 9 and 6, which is just mirroring the point totals for the employment domain, but that's not set in stone. So if you believe that a different split between those two metrics would be more appropriate, please let me know. We can discuss this now, or you can email me after this.
At the meeting, I think there seemed to be sort of equal concepts, 9 and 6, and also 10 and 5. So I think both of those were discussed.
Bob, I'm sorry, did you mean for the last domain, the candidate assessment?
Yes, the candidate assessment, what was discussed was either 10 points for the pedagogical and 5 for the content, or 9 and 6. So it wasn't strong one way or the other, but kind of that ratio in there was what people thought made most sense.
Okay, thank you.
That'd be another interesting one to talk about with our TACTI exec board toward the end of this, if they have any feedback.
I think so too. Thank you.
Okay, so to wrap up then, in the rest of this month and also in January, we will be producing the report card website along with our vendor. Then in early February, we will have the embargoed review period for EPPs. This is the same as what we had last year. So EPPs will have the opportunity to see their report card data before it is released to the public so that they can be prepared with any questions that people may have for them about their data. And then February 15th is the statutory deadline for release of the report card. This year, or in 2021, February 15th happens to be a holiday. It is President's Day. So we are anticipating that we will be able to release the report card the previous week rather than releasing it on that holiday Monday. But that depends a little bit on our website vendor. So we will give you updates on that as we know more.
Very good.
And that is all that I have for now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Erica. Great presentation. Amy, thank you too. Next up, Dean's impact memo. That's Michael and Amy, correct?
I'll be starting off with this one. Thank you, Madam Chair. Amy Owen, Director of Policy and Research for the State Board. Did your slide change as I just advanced? Just want to make sure I'm actually presenting. Great. Thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth. Madam Chair, I know you wanted to have this discussion in particular in November. The board members all received a memo from 7 deans of Tennessee EPPs who are working with a national group called Deans for Impact to craft a memo regarding candidate assessment and educator diversity. As you know, at the November board meeting, we heard on first reading a new policy about educator diversity. And one of the purposes of this memo was to share ideas from the dean's perspective on ways the state board could facilitate greater teacher diversity through working with EdPrep. So they shared several different ideas, and we just wanted to go through and share some highlights, some options, as well as some areas that were causing some concern or that might run into unexpected roadblocks from our staff's point of view. And again, this is the memo was shared with board members, and this is really just providing you all with background information, so feel free to stop me at any point in time. I put in italics the direct quotes from the memo that we received from the 7 deans. They stated that these proposals should be used to support the state's efforts to diversify the teacher workforce, and they proposed 2 main ideas regarding candidate licensure assessments. They kind of separated them. They looked at one was more about accountability and one was about an appeals process. In terms of accountability, the suggestion was that for EPPs that are at least meeting expectations on the report card in the areas we've just talked about regarding provider impact and candidate assessment, to allow those EPPs to identify up to 15% of their initial licensure candidates and exempt them from subject area licensure exams. The proposal was that the candidates should all still take the exam so they'd know how they were doing or any areas of weakness, But if the EPP identifies candidates who they think could be very strong educators despite potentially not having a passing score, that they would be able to exempt them from that requirement. The 15% they suggested as a starting point and have really close progress monitoring of this initiative to see whether those educators had effective outcomes in the classroom or not. They really emphasized the need to monitor and track this idea over time. The second proposal is more about an appeals process. It would have a similar effect, but rather than being based on scores from the report card, would allow EPPs to use an appeal process to identify which 15% of candidates could potentially be exempt from their subject area licensure exams. Again, with the idea that candidates would take the exam, but they could be exempted if they did not obtain passing scores, and the EPP, through its appeals process, thought that they could still be an effective teacher. I want to clarify that they reference another state board rule here about the existing appeal process. That's about admission to the EPP. To be admitted to an EPP, candidates need to have certain scores on either the SAT, ACT, or Praxis core assessments. However, being admitted to the EdPrep program is in many ways an institutional decision, and EPPs have an allowable flexibility here to create an appeal process where they can say, you know what, this candidate didn't have a high enough ACT score, maybe they just missed the cut, but we believe that through working with them over the next several years, we can get them up to a place where they could be licensed. So that is an existing allowable option for using to get students admitted to the EPP. The proposal is more about actually getting the license at the completion of the EPP. So our staff, and I appreciate we had our legal staff chime in on this as well, went through these two main proposals and identified some potential areas of concern or roadblocks that we just wanted to share with you all. And also we've reached out to the folks who coordinated the Dean's effort at Deans for Impact, so they're aware as well. There is a state law that requires all students who desire a license to teach must pass this test that measures professional knowledge and a standardized or criterion reference test for each desired area of endorsement. So it's pretty explicit. There is some flexibility if the candidate has certain kinds of disabilities or difficulties with actually taking the test for a year. But the law is pretty explicit on that point. We also do recognize as a staff that it's important for the state to maintain uniform requirements for all candidates. As we talked about in the ethics presentation, folks do get a state-level license to teach, and we want to be really clear with all districts and other folks when they're hiring a person with a Tennessee educator license that they can expect consistent requirements for educators who are receiving a state license. One just potential logistical challenge is that while educator licensure assessments are something that many EPPs require their candidates to pass before they'll recommend them to get a license, that's actually not necessary in the sense that they could recommend a candidate for a license based simply on completing their program and meeting the program expectations, and then candidates take the assessment and submit those scores to the state separately through the testing service. In other words, many EPPs want to make sure on the front end that they're not recommending someone for a license who can't pass the test, which is an effective practice, but that's not necessarily required. It could be that they recommend somebody and then the person submits scores to the state separately. So any sort of appeal process would need to actually be at the state level rather than necessarily at the EPP level, which would create something of a challenge for administration because, I mean, frankly, I would assume that any candidate who didn't pass would then reach out to the state and say, well, I think I should have being part of this appeals process for such and such reason. And at the state, we don't work closely with candidates the way that EPPs do, so we wouldn't necessarily know if those reasons are justified. That's what we really looked at from the state board staff side. I'll leave it for a moment in case Michael or anyone else from DOE or Angie, if you want to chime in from the legal perspective. And then we'll look at a few other suggestions that were part of that memo as well that might have a little bit more ability to move forward on. You want to dive in?
This is Michael, Senior Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation at the department. I don't necessarily have anything to add here. I would just say, and I'll cover this a little bit in my presentation, that generally speaking, conversations around improving diversity of the teacher workforce are happening very seriously right now. And so it's a very, very significant focus of our educator preparation working group. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that I think we're all on the same page with the what needs to be addressed. It's the how that I think is a little tricky. So when I present, I'll share a little bit of detail about the conversations that the Ed Prep working group has been having on this topic.
Thank you, Michael. I should have emphasized that more because you're absolutely right. And if there are certain licensure assessments that themselves EPPs find are not valuable or aligned to Tennessee academic standards or expectations for teachers, we're very open to that conversation of should there be a different kind of assessment, but it would need to be a conversation that's consistent for candidates statewide. Several additional proposals were included in this memo, and Michael, I'll look to you again because I know the department has been interested in some of these already, as has the state board. One idea was to identify candidates early on who may have challenges passing their licensure exams and intervene with them before they get to that point. I know one project that we're hoping to take on in 2021 from the state board side is to identify EPPs that do have really high pass rates on candidate assessments, particularly for candidates of color or candidates who might be coming in from less prepared backgrounds for whatever reason, and seeing what they do to get their candidates up to the level where they can pass, and then share that information back out. Another suggestion was to establish and pilot an alternative to the subject matter license assessments altogether. And the memo cited a project in Mississippi about this. I think that's a really interesting idea. It might run into the same problem about the existing law requiring assessments, but something like that could be used for any candidate for different purposes might be something that can get a little bit better traction moving forward. Certainly continuing to evaluate and remove barriers to program entry and completion as much as possible. That's something that I know Michael's team is working on. We're always looking at that in state board rules and policies as well. And thinking about how EPPs can recruit and invest in candidates from diverse backgrounds. Again, those are things that I know Tafty has talked about repeatedly and showcased presentations and working sessions on at different conferences over the years, and we're glad to continue supporting in those areas as well. Michael or others, anything to add here?
Not really, though. Again, I'll go into a little more detail later, especially around this number 3. The department is engaging in quite a bit of research around, and we're very fortunate right now to have some capacity on our research team to do this, but looking at, and I think this goes to something Amy just said as well, not all EPPs are created equal in this space. And so what we're trying to find are where are those potential outliers, those EPPs that are kind of bucking the trend and doing a good job recruiting teachers of color, especially in communities where, we often hear East Tennessee, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that. But I think that we're starting to really dig into that and also do a better job of looking at the individual disparities between EPPs and their primary partner districts, which is also not all, the same. And so we're seeing that there are some EPPs that are looking more like their primary partner districts, and that allows us to, I think, advocate for some of these as well.
And I apologize, I know this is a bit of a Debbie Downer presentation in terms of we've got some really interesting, innovative ideas, but that there would be certain roadblocks to moving forward with them. But we did want to be candid as a staff to make sure that you as board members had all the background information available. And also, as Michael mentioned, from that advocacy perspective, it's often helpful for folks to know, is this a state board rule and policy issue, or is it an issue with state law or other things like that, to know where to direct advocacy efforts. So that's part of our goal as well. Do y'all have any further questions on this topic?
I don't have questions, more along the lines of, and we've talked about this a number of times, when we first received the memo from Deans for Impact, I was certainly eager to dig into it to determine what could we possibly do as we grapple with the issue of diversity, candidates of diverse backgrounds, and just in general, our candidate pool that has been, of course, we have this pipeline issue. The workforce of educators is just not where it needs to be. And so I say that to sit here and say, I really do want us to hear, whether we have enough time today, I do want us to continue to have the conversation with our partners at TACTI around the things that have brought them to this conclusion, especially when you think about the barriers. And I know, Michael, you mentioned the LEAs, and so what's happening in the districts, because I've said this many times, having worked closely with districts before I came on the board. What are you doing to prepare your own workforce, and what are you doing to discourage students from taking that path, and what are you doing to ensure that they're being prepared? What programs are you offering to encourage them so that when they do get to the application process to get in as a candidate, are they ready? You know, so the burden is not just on the EVP, but what can we do? So I want us to continue this and find solutions to address this diversity challenge and the pipeline in general. So just wanted to say that. Thank you.
And I will say, Lillian, one other approach that we've taken on this is looking carefully at our licensure assessments and whether or not they have disparate effects on candidates based on their racial or ethnic background. I know Erica has shared at previous subcommittee meetings and also at this fall TACTI conference that what we're seeing on EdPPA data is that the gaps are really narrowing or in some cases disappearing based specifically on Tennessee candidates who've taken the test in recent years. And we're obviously going to track that as more and more candidates take the EdPPA to make sure that we're not having some sort of biased outcomes or results. I think that's also a place where we can continue to work with and push on our partners at external assessment vendors to say, what's your national data? Do you have Tennessee-specific data? Are there certain assessments that might have more or less of a disparate impact? We want to be aware of those things and make sure that any assessment we use is not having negative effects on certain candidates in systematic ways, and that those assessments are valuable and aligned to what we really care about in terms of Tennessee educator content knowledge.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Amy.
Absolutely. That's it from me, unless y'all have further questions here. Okay.
Before we move into, Michael, if you do not mind, I think we're going to take a 5-minute break at this juncture, if that's okay with everyone. So we'll be back at, let's see what time, 11:03 or 11:02. Thank you. Quick break. We'll get started in a minute. I don't recognize David Donaldson. You grew a beard.
Neither does my mother.
Nice to see you.
It's a pleasure, Chairman Harker. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can get started again. Michael, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to make sure I have control to move forward in this presentation. Let's see. There we go, great. Michael Durline, Senior Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation. Thank you, as always, for having me. I enjoy these conversations immensely, so happy to be here. Today, I will share information about some prospective recommendations that will be coming your way. You see a lot of us in your state board meetings, and that is not going to change over the next few months. We've got a lot going on. So I'll share information specifically about school services personnel licensure and potential reactivation pathways, requirements related to clinical practice, a potentially new and innovative pathway to additional endorsements, more details on our approach to expectations for the new integrated early childhood endorsements, and we have quite a few EPP and specialty area program recommendations coming. I'll give a summary of those. And then we'll talk a little bit about an update on annual reports and continue that conversation that we just had around recruitment and admissions requirements as it relates to conversations that EPWG has been having lately. So licensure policy now, the new one, can't really say that anymore, has been in effect for 5 or 6 years. And so, you know, what we've done, I think, collectively is really focused on what sort of feedback are we getting, where are we seeing pain points, and over the last few years, you all have done, I think, a great job kind of adjusting the policy to address some challenges that have come out of it. One thing that we're now looking pretty carefully at is the possibility of allowing school services personnel folks, so these are the speech language pathologists and school counselors and audiologists and psychologists, to be able to use a nationally issued credential to reactivate their Tennessee issued credential. Currently, the rule is pretty limited and says that these folks would have to take and pass the required content assessment. Well, there are national organizations that have very, very high standards for issuance of their credentials, and sometimes there's also a pretty significant cost associated with maintaining those credentials. And so we are planning to bring a recommendation that will allow some flexibility here in certain areas. Not to say all areas necessarily. We're really trying to do a careful deep dive into the requirements for each to determine if we feel that they're appropriate, but I think it would probably apply to the majority of areas.
Hey, Michael,
yeah.
Is this one that you plan to bring to the February board meeting, or?
I believe so, yes. The timing right now, all our recommendations are being reviewed internally, so that is the plan, but we certainly have some steps internally before we commit to that.
That's great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Similarly, and I will do my absolute best to explain this, I will say I should have started with this, that we've been working really closely with some folks on the special populations team on these recommendations, and so they are our content experts here, and I will likely bring them along with me when we bring these recommendations in case you all have detailed questions. Speech language pathology assistants. This is a role, a real role that exists outside of schools and inside of schools. And many years ago, the board created a speech language teacher role that doesn't really exist anywhere else. And so we are really trying to wrap our heads around how can we kind of better align those roles that are outside of schools, like this one, with those that are in schools. And so there was an employment standard rule that you all passed not all that long ago on this regarding this role, but now we're looking carefully at that, and we may want to recommend an endorsement in this area because it may actually bring the most clarity around the role and the paths that one might take to be able to function in this role. So I know we've had some conversations about this as well. Currently, the state board rule says that only 50% of the clinical practice may take place in a Category 2 school. And we've been looking carefully at that. We've been hearing from our partner EPPs across the state. There are many that really focus on placing candidates in Category 2 and 3 private settings. And ultimately, those educators get employed in those settings. And so we're talking about people who really don't end up teaching in a public setting. That said, I think over the last year or so, we've had some hesitation on this recommendation, but I think taking a big step back, because it truly aligns with our EPP's individual missions, and EPPs are still held accountable for the quality of clinical practice. They're still held accountable for outcomes. I think that it might be an appropriate time to make a recommendation to expand the allowance of where clinical practice can take place.
So I'm smiling about this one. Lots of conversations we've had about this one.
That's right.
If this moves forward, I think there are certainly a lot of our private colleges that would be thrilled to know that they have this opportunity.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You know what, I think we feel pretty confident too that it doesn't diminish the quality of the preparation, right? When we do a comprehensive review, we've still got a team of folks that's digging into that clinical practice regardless of where the setting is. Okay, a new one that we haven't talked about yet. So right now, when we think about licensed educators, they really only have two pathways to add an endorsement to their license. One is they take an assessment, the currently required content assessment. And two, if the grade span or content area of any endorsement that they currently hold on their license is kind of different, a little too different than what they're trying to add, they have to go back to an educator preparation provider. They likely have to take coursework and take the required assessment. So we've been really kind of revisiting this, thinking about, are there additional pathways that we could consider here that would allow licensed educators to add endorsements to their license without having to go take coursework, without the cost associated with it. And so that's a potential recommendation that could come your way. And really, I think the idea would be to focus on areas of shortage and potentially start there. And in doing that, educators would have to complete coursework or micro-credentials that were developed by the department with collaboration from content experts. And that content would be aligned to the same standards that EPPs are expected to align their programming to. I will kind of just a reminder that when someone goes to an EPP to take coursework to add an endorsement to their license, we don't actually review or recommend approval of that additional endorsement program. EPPs must be approved to offer that endorsement at the initial level. So they are reviewed, but the process by which an EPP determines what coursework is necessary for an individual is usually an individualized approach. So they take into consideration what the individual is coming with when they determine what they have to take. Our guidance to EPPs is that they should be looking at those standards. And so if we propose something like this, we would do exactly the same. We would look at those same standards and make sure our content is aligned to that. And individuals would have to take the content assessment. So that would be standardized as well. So we wanted to share this. Again, I know we haven't had a conversation about this, just conceptually. So happy to pause if you have any questions.
So let me make sure I understand this last one that you're talking about, and I'll do it with an example. So I'm a professional engineer, okay? So for my content assessment, my professional license, which is a state license in the state of Tennessee, would that fit the content assessment? And if I wanted to go teach fundamentals of engineering in high school or something like that, I could go to one of these micro-credential courseworks that aligns with the EPPs and take those courses, and then I could get a license that way. Is that what you're saying, or?
Not quite. So to clarify, this would only be for individuals who already hold a Tennessee teaching license.
Okay.
This is not.
That's what I want to understand. Okay.
Yeah, what this is not doing is proposing that the department become an approved EPP for initial licensure. This is really just focused on folks who have already been through a preparation program, already hold a license, and are seeking to add another endorsement to their
endorsement. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Some updates in the early childhood special education space. We've been busy. We have an internal working group that has been fantastic. I just want to kind of throw it out there that I think the department right now, we are doing a really, really great job of cross-team collaboration. And this is a really good example of that. So if you recall, about a year ago, the board approved 2 new early childhood endorsements. They're called integrated early childhood endorsements, birth through kindergarten and pre-K through 3rd grade. The board also approved a phase out of all existing early childhood endorsements by 2025. There has to be that off ramp to give time for current candidates to complete programs that they signed up for and to allow EPPs to develop and get approved internally courses and programs leading to these new endorsements. So over the last few months, and there was a delay, and the delay was mostly because the national standards that would apply here were delayed. They were supposed to be released in July or August, but they weren't released until, I believe, early November. So quite a delay there. But we have really kind of got it together and really pulled everyone together to have some very serious conversations about the standards that should apply to these 2 endorsements. The program component. So what sorts of things specific to these endorsements do we want to see when an EPP is proposing a new program in this area? And then lastly, candidate assessment. What assessments are appropriate for these 2 endorsements? And so we have some recommendations in all of these areas. We've really dug into those standards. We really try to, a couple things I'll just say that were the emphasis of our analysis there. One was, how do we make sure that these endorsements are truly integrated? What we want here is not a series of programs that delivers general education content over here and special education content over here, but that the content, the clinical practice experiences are truly integrated. So that's been a very serious focus of our conversations. And then also, how do we differentiate between the birth through kindergarten endorsement and the pre-K through 3 endorsement? Especially when we're kind of entering that birth through kindergarten space, there are needs that are kind of unique to organizations like Head Start and other places where they're dealing with the youngest children. And in doing that, we really need to consider what are the specific needs of that group and what do teachers need to know and be able to do to serve those students, those children. And so we'll have recommendations here. In addition to having an internal working group, we brought back the external working group that includes EPP and LEA representation across the state. That group was brought together to come up with the initial recommendations around the endorsement and has now revisited the standards, program components, and assessments. So this just kind of outlines what I just described here on the top. We did meet with Pearson and ETS. Ultimately, ETS had more options to offer here, and so you'll see those recommendations. And then the next phase of this work, if the board approves these standards and expectations, we then need to develop a proposal template. So what do EPPs actually have to produce to show us that they are aligning these new programs to the new standards? And so that's the next phase of this work, probably the most immediate thing we need to do. There are also questions about, well, how do we create pathways for licensed educators to add these endorsements? That's a tough one because no one has been trained in this way. We do have one dual endorsement, or early childhood special education endorsement, but not many programs offer that. So there's definitely some conversations to be had about what sort of training or assessments would an individual need to take if they already hold a license. And then, and this is, I think, specifically related to the birth through kindergarten endorsement. Right now, in order to advance your license, you must have experience in a public pre-K-12 school. And so, one of our work group members brought up the notion that, well, if we want the folks holding the birth through kindergarten endorsement to be able to advance their license, we're going to need to consider experience that's outside of that space. And so that's another area where this working group is going to really need to dig in. As always, I know the slide's a bit busy. Probably could have formatted that better. But as always, we have quite a few EPP and specialty area program recommendations. I've organized this by the Cape State Joint Reviews, state managed reviews, and then a status change one, which we haven't had before. But the state board rule allows us to, once an EPP is granted full approval minor stipulations, and we work with them for a period of time, and we believe that they've addressed the deficiencies sufficiently, we can come back to you all and have that minor stipulations designation removed. And so this just kind of outlines those recommendations. You're probably sensing that the norm these days is now full approval minor stipulations. I think that's because we've set a pretty high bar. I think our process is such that getting just full approval is quite challenging. And so full approval minor stipulations is not a bad thing either. It just simply means that there were some areas for improvement, some deficiencies that we then work with the provider on addressing. Oh, by the way, these are all reviews that took place last spring. And so kind of our pattern now is to bring them the following semester. So as far as ongoing EPP monitoring and technical assistance, interim reviews, just a reminder, those are required if an EPP fell below expectations 2 years in a row on our annual reports. We are holding 4 interim reviews, and so that is a pretty intensive action planning, or if you're familiar with school improvement plans, that sort of process where we're checking in with that provider, we're approving their action plan on the front end, and then they actually have to start implementing that plan and showing us evidence of implementation. We also have a similar process for EPPs that are designated as full approval minor stipulations. And then probationary approval major stipulations is a more intensive process that, as you know, within 3 years will result in a focused review. So just wanted to call this out as, I think it's a shift that the department has made, the board has made in its rules and policies that has really allowed us to move out of just the compliance space and start to provide, with the limited capacity we have, but provide technical assistance to these EPPs. There's also a lot of networking happening, which I think is great. We're making connections between EPPs on very specific issues that they're having, and that's, I think, resulting in some significant improvement. I think this is my last slide. Annual reports are on track for production. This will be, I think, our 3rd year of the performance reports, and we are very soon going to be in a place where, like you all have done with the report card, we'll probably want to revisit our metrics and determine if we want to make any changes to those. So in the future, we will bring that information to you. And we're also trying to work on providing even more granular impact data at the candidate level to EPPs. We're allowed to do this in the law, actually, and we've had a portal developed by SAS over the years, but EPPs are expressing a need to have even more data in this area, so we're going to work on producing a report that they can use kind of for their own purposes. Educator Preparation Working Group, we have some members dropping off. In a moment, I'll just recognize those members. We have just made some decisions about the new folks that will join us in 2021. We're really excited about the diversity of the group that's going to be joining us, diversity of experiences, relevancy of the work that they've done. And we anticipate that we'll continue to have a strong focus on candidate recruitment and diversity. So I did want to call out some folks on our research team, Kevin Schaff and Dhatori Chanduru. She has been pretty integral in providing us with some research we can bring to the Ed Prep Working Group so that they can react to it and we can start to potentially make some recommendations here. In our Domain 1 in our annual reports have been a focus as well. So to get really specific, we have a metric on there that requires that or expects that 95% of candidates be admitted with an ACT, SAT, or Praxis core score that meets the policy requirements. And we also have a metric that really pushes providers to recruit more diverse candidates. Those two things may be in conflict. And so we are trying to really approach that carefully and think through, should we make some modifications to our metrics in that space to increase the likelihood that folks will be able to truly focus on recruiting diverse candidates. Lastly, just wanted to call out, EPWG is a fantastic group. We couldn't do this work without them. And these individuals noted here are going to be rolling off, so they served for 2 years. So I just wanted to recognize them. I don't think any of them are on, but huge thanks to the folks who take their time to participate in this work. And that's it. Happy to take any questions if you have them.
Michael, I do not have any questions for you, but you said it somewhere along the way that you've been incredibly busy, and I know working with the teams, and you talked about the cross collaboration, and I'm incredibly encouraged by the things that you shared with us today, and this is what we've all been working toward, and I want to recognize the great work that you have done and continue to do, and David, of course, you as well. So thank you again. Looking forward to what you'll bring before the board in the coming, maybe the next meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, you all may have noticed that in the chat box, we have received notification from Dr. Hunsater that they're having some technical issues. So if we ask a question, can you speak? Can you hear us?
I can, yes, thank you.
Because I think what we're going to do, and Amy, you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just jumping in here. I think the intention of this particular section is really to have you lead us through a discussion, particular of what you've heard today and the topics that we've discussed, and where you have particular points that you want to make to us and share with us, whether it's something we noted along the way or you picked up on yourself that you think we need to know. Amy, did I miss anything before we turn it over to Dr. Hunsater?
No, that would be great. And I appreciate Dr. Hunsater and the TACNY Executive Board reaching out during the fall TACNY conference with this idea that, you know, normally we have a subcommittee meeting, EPPs might listen in or listen afterward, and then decide to follow up with staff or board members. This is our trial of having some more real-time feedback. As we've discussed all these issues that are relevant to educator preparation, let's hear from experts who live and breathe this day in, day out before we even close out the meeting. So Dr. Hunsater, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you all for being here.
Okay, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I only could hear you about half of the time. So I was following along on slides and missed a lot of the audio. So it might help if you are able to just kind of provide an outline, just tell me, like, here's a topic, and
Sure.
then I get a little bit of feedback.
Let's start at the beginning, if you don't mind. The initial presentation from State Board legal staff on training options regarding the Teacher Code of Ethics and how we could also make sure educators receive training on state board licensure discipline rules and expectations, whether that should occur, how it's occurring now at the EPP level, what kind of support materials you'd like to state, just what different options there might be.
So, I can't really speak to what a lot of EPPs are doing. I do know that we are all doing something. For us, it's at the onset of the program when we onboard students. I'm not sure who posed it, but at the LEA level of having these topics, maybe questions starters, it would happen periodically to kind of heighten teachers' awareness of various ethics issues. That's something I think we would embrace at the EPP level as well. If, we would absolutely love to have whatever training materials you could provide, and we would find ways to integrate that in our programming. But, as you analyze data and see what are the real issues, what are the things that are tending to end up on your having to deal with discipline issues, making us aware of those through your newsletter, we can then take that and run with that in the classroom. I think it's an interesting question too, like how widespread is our issue compared to other states? Even one issue is too many, but there are people make poor choices, and it's a lack of understanding, a lack of training, and sometimes people make poor choices. So I think it will help moving forward to have more comparative data about where we stand. I know that quite a few other board members are on the call, and I don't want to hog the floor or pretend to really speak for them. So I would just invite any of them that want to just interject to feel free to jump in. So I think the next, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Tricia. Renee Murley, I know our UT system team is working on a grant where we're enhancing and developing even more with our ethics training and implementing more work. So that's something, I think, as Tricia said, we're all doing something. It may look different at every institution, but I think that's something to highlight, is that we're excited to be able to do that through the UT system. And so we'll keep everybody posted as we move forward, but we would certainly be interested in listening and having other materials available to us as well.
Okay, so the next topic from the Deans for Impact.
I think we talked a little bit about the EdPrep report card right before that. I know several folks here were on our advisory council, so I don't think it will be news for them. But if anybody else wants to weigh in on the discussion about the report card, particularly regarding candidate assessment, if reading scores should be broken out separately from other subject areas, and about the point values for candidate assessment.
All for high standards, but I think so as it relates to the proposed new floor and targets. I agree. I believe that the people that I interact with at other EPPs, we are all extremely committed to continuous improvement, and we're excited by some of the improvements that we've made. Some of the metrics are really challenging, and there's a lot of variation, based on the populations that we serve. We're going to do extremely well in some areas, like our candidates tend to get hired and tend to stay. But some of the other metrics are going to be really challenging for us. And I think a question has to be that if you are continuing to see improvement based on the current requirements, I'm a little concerned about what the overall impact might be and who we feel like we can and can't accept into our programs if those standards keep getting tougher and tougher to meet. So you mentioned one in particular, about our ability to accept a certain percentage of candidates who don't meet the testing standard. Because of our EPP size, we have, at the undergraduate level, we now, because of the new metric, accept 0. We do, and we do, because we can't risk it, because we don't always have 20 new ones starting in every cohort. So if we accept even 1, then we may not meet the state metric. And I think it's important those high standards, but also there are times when we can identify, especially people who are career changers, who would be outstanding teachers in the classroom. We can't afford to accept them. And so anything that pushes this in the direction where we potentially miss out on some high quality teachers because of the lack of flexibility, I think in the end it ends up damaging the profession. So I go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I agree with you. And I know on the report card side, last year we actually removed that ACT, SAT Praxis Core metric as being scored. It is still on the annual reports from the DOE about a certain percentage of candidates that you can admit on appeal. Michael, I know, is working with the EPWG on either raising or really revisiting what that quote-unquote cap is, because that cap is not in rule or policy. It's just on the annual reports right now.
Right. That's correct.
What was the thing? From anybody else?
This is Donna Nebel at UT Martin. I understand what you're saying, but when we have to weigh the difference between students who qualify with the correct ACT based on how well they might teach, I agree with Tricia in that we have a decision to make. First of all, the scores are not negotiable. So at UT Martin, we require 22 on the ACT. So our appeal process allows a student to enter with a 21, which is state requirement. But allowing folks to enter with anything less, not just in this category, but some of the other categories, I do feel like there are times when we miss out on excellent candidates because we are concerned about how it's going to affect our report cards, even though we know, having worked with them, that they could very well be successful.
Got it. I think Michael also had something to chime in on regarding the appeals process for program admittance. Yeah,
I want to clarify. So the way that because Amy's right, really the only space where this is an accountability measure or required is in annual reports. The way that the state board rule is framed is interesting, though, I'll say, because it very clearly sets an expectation for the minimum ACT score, ACT, SAT, Praxis Core. And then it has the caveat that 4 candidates can be admitted on appeal, and the department needs to have on file appeals procedures, that sort of thing. And so with the EPWG, we've really been digging into that. And one thing that has come up that I hadn't even thought of was that the appeals procedure as a phrase to indicate that an individual person is being admitted on appeal is a little problematic, because what it does is it actually suggests that it is kind of solely the individual's fault, I guess, that they are not able to meet this bar that's been set forth with the admissions assessments. And what we're hearing from EPPs, a lot of them, and as you look across the country, ACT is actually being dropped for admission to universities quite a bit, quite frequently. So what we're hearing from EPPs on admissions to their preparation program is that oftentimes EPPs are considering other factors and even as other types of assessments as they determine whether to admit somebody or not. And EPPs still have the ability to counsel folks out. So if they kind of make a bad decision on the front end, oftentimes EPPs will, and they have benchmarks throughout the program, and if that person is just not meeting the benchmarks, they can counsel that person out. They can also mark them in our licensure system as off track. And so, the conversation, to get a little deeper in what I mentioned earlier with EPWG, the conversation that's happening is really around, how could we potentially propose a more sort of holistic approach to the admissions process. Donna, I hear you about kind of UT Martin's 22 ACT expectation and 21 being the state requirement, but technically it's not. You can go beyond that. And so if you're finding that you're not able to admit folks who you believe would be truly successful based on your other assessments, then you can and probably should do that.
Okay, so what's the next item about?
The memo we received from the 7 deans who are working with Games for Impact.
And I'm coming into this conversation, at the tail end because I haven't heard any of their earlier work. But I would be much more inclined to say I would like to see flexibility at the front end and not a lot of flexibility at the back end. Because we need an opportunity to develop the student and prepare them for the classroom, but we want to be sure that anything we actually put in the classroom is truly prepared. In my own experience, I've seen an occasional student complete our program occasionally and not be able to pass the assessment. And in most of those cases, it's probably a good thing that they aren't going to get a license. So that may sound harsh, but I don't personally know of any of our candidates who have completed, have failed the assessments, who I was just kind of heartbroken that this person really needs to be in the classroom, whereas front end, some of the compelling stories that we've had to say no to, those are heartbreakers. The people who I think have made, they're dragging around their history from 20 years ago or 10 years ago and aren't going to get accepted even at the graduate level because of, a lower division GPA, for example. And they would make truly outstanding teachers, but they don't even have the opportunity. So that's makes sense.
I think that's really great feedback. I know that we have a lot of trust in our EPPs, and there's been a ton of changes in recent years, and Michael's team works really closely with y'all as well. To have those on-the-ground judgments of working with individual candidates who you really get to know, and we just don't have that at the state level in terms of volume and distance from people to know who should or shouldn't get a waiver and why on the licensure end. But when we're talking about program admittance, that really is an EPP decision. Michael or others, would you want to add anything?
Well, sorry, I changed the orientation. I could not find the mute button. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that this time is an appropriate one to really dig into this, as I said earlier. And it feels like everybody's kind of on the same page with the conversations that need to happen and the potential impact that could have. And I also don't hear anybody suggesting that it's lowering the quality or the standards and expectations, because, and I think that's why it's important, Tricia's comment about potentially looking more closely at the front end admissions, but keeping the back end requirements consistent, I think is a really good one.
Michael, to speak to your point about removal of ACT requirements for admission even to our universities, we are seeing that across the state. Most of our public schools we're seeing that's no longer a requirement. They're looking at GPAs and other opportunities to submit for admission. I don't know if that was, I don't anticipate that will change. I think, we had that discussion in our office this week, just the mere fact that I think people will say, well, I was admitted to the university, but you won't let me now be admitted into UTC School of Education. So I think we're preparing for those conversations and looking at what you're exactly talking about. But that is happening across the state, where that ACT admission requirement is being eliminated, or an option, or for it to be opted out by candidates or students who are applying for universities.
And the same is true in the private as well. which is going to get really complicated when these same students get ready to apply to teacher education. They haven't even taken the ACT.
It does seem like the time is right, both philosophically but also logistically, as we're in the middle of the pandemic and things are changing, that there's something that, as Michael said, maybe not even using the word appeal, because as he said, that kind of puts the onus on the candidate, like you didn't do something that you ought to have, but maybe something about admission based on EPP standards, admission based on EPP framework, or whatever language we come up with for the many things you look at about a candidate before you admit them into your program. Our last topic was the discussions from DOE for items that are likely to be coming at the February board meeting or at another one shortly thereafter in 2021. So now feel free to ask Michael any questions that you may have there.
Can you go back to that slide?
Let's see, who is presenter at the moment? I don't know. Is it moving when I click?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to, let's see here. I'll start right here, and I can move forward if y'all like. This is the beginning of the discussion about secondary items.
We don't offer either of those, so I don't have anything to contribute.
This conversation about allowing clinical prep. Sorry, go ahead.
I said, amen to this. We've had one of the most outstanding candidates who are, say, parents in private school who decide they want to teach, but they want to teach at their child's private school, and we've had to say, there's not a lot we can do for you. You can't do your clinical work there. If it's somebody who maybe graduated out of a private school and wants to go back and teach, so we don't have the conflict of them being a parent. It's been very limiting with the current guidelines, and I think this is a really great move.
I'll just go slowly. Anybody else feel free to jump in as you like. This idea about micro-credentials for licensure for endorsement pathways, rather?
I think the use of micro-credentials would be somewhat liberating for us and for students to have a different way to earn these positions simply because of their backgrounds and the fact that their backgrounds are so varied. So I appreciate that.
And I would say, by the same token, I appreciate EPPs right now have a fair amount of latitude in determining whether a candidate should be recommended for a license outside of their initial grade band or whatever based on the requirements the EPP determines. You take that responsibility seriously, but appreciate having the ability to of candidates, our former graduates who want to go into a different area of teaching.
Comments on early childhood and special education endorsements.
We don't offer the early childhood. I don't know if anyone else on this call, any of our EPPs do.
UTC offers that dual licensure program with early childhood and early childhood special ed, and that has been primarily our program up until about 5 years ago when we expanded that. So that has been something we've worked with for a long time, and so we're anxious to have additional conversations because we feel like it's been a successful program for our community and our region.
This is Clinton Smith at UT Martin. We were approved for the new dual endorsement back in June, I think it was. Will we have to do anything different?
Hey, Clinton. So potentially, yes. This was the endorsement that you're referring to is not these endorsements. What I envision, though, is that for providers that already have these dual endorsement programs set up in early childhood, general and special education, the application process might look a little different because you've already demonstrated alignment to some of the standards that we'd be recommending. So we're probably going to have to deal with some of those on a case-by-case basis, but we'll make sure we provide clear guidance around it.
Don't imagine there's too many questions here, although some of you all may be on this list.
I don't think we showed up on that particular list, but we just went through the process last fall. Okay, there we are. And we just submitted our action plan. I just wanted to say that I think it's a really healthy process. And no one likes to be told that there's anything they need to work on in their program, even though when the state is not there, we're all talking about that we need to do a lot of work on our program. But of course. But I would say that the action plan process, the template, all of it, I think it really focused our attention on the things that we really do need to work on. And having to revisit it a year from now is going to really, I don't want to say keep our feet to the fire. I mean, we're self-motivated, but it's the reality of delivering teacher preparation programs with all the complications of COVID. It's quite honestly, we need something that's going to say you have to deal with this even if you feel like you can't do one more thing. So I just want to compliment the overall process. It's still fairly new, and from what I heard, this is really telling, and I really want the board to hear this too. We recently had, we every month or so, we have a South Regional phone call with all of the leaders of the state, like the TACI, okay, so all the ACTE state leaders. And when you hear on that call about the relationships between EPPs, DOE, and state boards, I basically kind of raised my hand and I said, if you would like to hear how it can be, we are happy to talk to various states. And I volunteered you, Michael, not by name, but I said, I guarantee that I can get some people from the department to be part of the conversation about how we can all work together to improve teacher preparation, because what we have as far as collaboration and single-minded, dedication to this work does not exist in most other states, and we should not take it for granted.
While we're speaking highly of each other, I would say that, that is also in part to the fact that I think our EPP community over the last, 7-8 years, I would say has really opened up to that idea and have been willing to, acknowledge that no one's perfect and no program is perfect and collaborate with each other. I think, like I said earlier, we're seeing so much more of that. The TACI conference has really shifted toward that as well. And so we're thankful for the fact that there's an environment that allows us to do that.
I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to reiterate what Tricia said. It has been, serving as a state lead for the review process of another EPP, and then being on the receiving end of the CAPE process. I want the state board to know that the hard work that the State Department of Education has put into design and align the work for the state approval process is just as strenuous and thorough as the CAPE national accreditation process. In fact, I think in a lot of ways it's so much better because of the rubrics that have been developed and the feedback that's available and I have, on a regular basis question why we need CAPE when we have such an outstanding Tennessee approval process that's just as rigorous and sometimes even more so than what the national CAPE accreditation process is.
Nay, I'd just like to say I totally agree with that statement. The last 4 years especially, I think we've all come a long way as far as collaboration and the use of data. I appreciate the board and the department for providing us with the data that we can examine and identify areas of concern versus strengths. And it's just been a great time to be in the EPP space, I think.
Well, it's been a pleasure always to work with our EPP partners and also with our experts like Michael at the department, and we appreciate you all bearing with us as we go back and fine-tune our rules and policies. I know it can be confusing, but we really do appreciate the feedback and knowing what is and what isn't working when you're actually working with candidates. I think we're about at the end of our topics. I know Michael talked about EPWG, so if there's any comments there, please let us know.
I'm a little bit sad that I timed out. I did my 2 years and then I had to move on. It's a really healthy process, and I think every EPP should at some point have some representative on it, because the department listens and we have hard conversations and we wrestle with things, and I think we're all better for it. So. And it's another thing, those kinds of things are not happening in a lot of other states. Nothing even remotely like that.
Well, Madam Chair, Sarah, board members, do you all have any final words or questions?
I'll jump in real quickly here just at the end to say thank you to all of you. I try to do more listening than talking on these meetings, and I always am taking notes and learning so much from our board, from our partners at the department. I appreciate our TACTI members joining us in this way at the end of the subcommittee. I think it really illustrates the close partnerships and the work, as all of you have just expressed, that are happening in Tennessee. And it's just great to end on an optimistic note and think about the work we have ahead and the partnerships that we're really solidifying across different organizational lines. And big kudos to Michael and David at the department. I appreciate Tricia and Renee and others, and Donna, speaking to the hard work that they're doing, because this has been a long process. I've seen it from a couple different seats now, and to get to the place where we are feels really good, and I'm just thrilled to hear how well you feel like it's working and how we're all able to embrace and use the data in such constructive ways. That is no small feat. So we'll continue to work better and stronger together. I know over the next months and years, we're going to need to work even harder coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. So just appreciate everybody's time today. I think it's been a really good discussion. I know we'll have future meetings like this where we'll continue on some of the points that were brought up today. But thanks to the state board team, department team, and our TACTI friends and our board members. That's all for me.
This is Bob. If I can just add one quick thing, Lillian. As you know, I do serve on the EPP Advisory Council for the state board. And that, too, I think is something that I really value, as far as being able to hear from the EPPs and the other members of the Advisory Council from the leaders across the state in education. So I think there's a couple of working groups there that are all very effective and good places for input. That's all I had.
Thank you. And I do want to echo what Sarah said. First of all, I've been grinning from ear to ear. I don't know if you all could see me. I know we can't all completely see everyone across the board, but I think this has been an excellent meeting, and having you, Dr. Hunsetter, and all of the other executive board members for TACTI with us today has been really a great highlight for us. And hearing directly from you and the feedback that you shared is incredibly important to all of us. And I do believe that when we're outside of our silos and we're collaborating with one another, that we all have the same end goal in mind. We're much better when we can do that. And so thank you for your input. I thank Michael for the great work he does, in particular when you were bragging on him, because I know he deserves that. And the department is a great partner with all of us. So thank you all so much. I don't know if Michael has anything, Mike Edwards has anything he wants to add. I don't want to dismiss giving him that opportunity before we adjourn.
No, well, yeah, I think that the EEPs are really focused. I think it's great because really our future holds. They're the gatekeepers, and they're focused. I'm encouraged greatly. So I agree with you and Bob. And Sarah. This is a great meeting.
Great work. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks to each of our presenters. And without further comments, I do want to just wish you all the best. Stay safe. Enjoy your holidays. Merry Christmas if you celebrate it, and Happy New Year. And we are officially adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.